Welcome to our study in the book of John. We're going to be picking it up from John chapter 2. Thank you for joining us. And feel free to send us an email with any questions, thoughts, or comments. Have a wonderful day. So John chapter 2, verse 1. So the title of this section is the water turned to wine. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it out. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine when the guests have well drunk. Then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." And the word drunk here is when they've all drank. That's what the translation. Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine when the guests have finished drinking the bad one. Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine. So basically, they set out the good one when it finishes, when people finish drinking it, then they get the other one. That's what he's saying. This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. I want to take a second quickly to address the big question right away. Let's just address it for a few minutes, and then we'll move on to the other part. And you might have noticed I was trying to clarify the word when they use the word drink and drunk and so on, the present participle. It is important to interpret the Bible as a whole. And I've heard people that have actually said, well, Jesus turned the water into wine, therefore people should drink as much as they want to do because Jesus turned water into wine, so that's okay in all levels. Some might argue that drinking wine in all forms is okay, in excess, and so on and so forth, because Jesus turned water into wine. So let's address it briefly. There is a call, very clear in the Bible, to avoid drunkenness. That's not in question. It's very clear. But it's also a call to watch out for the weak and for those who fall due to our liberty. And I'll explain what I mean. Just a minute here, and then we'll take comments on this. The book of Galatians addresses this issue that even if we have liberty, we should be very careful not to allow our liberty to cause others to fall. Romans chapter 13 and 14, if you haven't had a chance, I would say Romans 12, 13, 14, and 15 address some of this as well. For the sake of the weak and unbelievers, there are certain things that we should strive not to do. And so we'll talk about these in a second. So let me take a step back. There's a lot of dialogue people can have about what was the chemistry of the wine at the wedding. I'm not going to go into all those details. We just know that at this wedding, which has some level of connection to the faith, that drunkenness would have not been acceptable. And number 2, we do not know when it talks about, well, I don't know personally, when it talks about water being turned to wine, someone said, are we talking about something that is still a juice or something that has become a full-blown a fermented wine? Well, it was just turned into wine. Do we know? I don't know. All I know is that Jesus, number 1, will not tolerate or celebrate drunkenness. That's very clear. And number 2, this was a wedding. And I'll come back to some of the lessons from the wedding itself. But it's just interesting that this issue comes up about drinking, and that's not the scope of our class. But I just want to encourage us to recognize something, that some things in moderation might quote unquote not be called a sin in the Bible, even though it clearly says drunkenness is a sin. But it is important to then ask ourselves the secondary question. Is what I'm doing profitable? That's a question to ask. Number 2. Number 3, is this going to cause someone else to stumble? So I want to just address this briefly. So number 1, again, the Bible speaks clearly to drunkenness, and it makes that clear. We do know that Paul told Timothy to drink a little wine for some pain that he was having, for his ulcers, some people might say, or different explanations. But we can't isolate the passage from John chapter 2 and allow it to determine the whole conversation about whether or not drinking on any level is okay or not. And we can discuss this in more detail. But I just want to remind us that if drunkenness is a sin and drunkenness is condemned in the Bible, just as many other sins are condemned in the same passage, drunkenness is listed, well then that tells us that if somebody knows that touching this thing, whatever temptation, will cause them to sin, then they shouldn't touch it, right? If touching something will lead them to that sin, then they should avoid it. Number two, some people might not even have a problem themselves with a particular issue. This is not only about wine, this is about general things overall. And you can think about some of these in your life as well. But there are some things that are not in and of themselves bad. For example, back then people were eating meat that was sacrificed to idols. And some Christians did not have a problem with it. They didn't care about those idols. They knew those idols were false, so they could eat the meat. But some other people, when they saw a mature believer eating that meat, it led them into a dimension that could cause them to sin or to get into trouble with this, that, and the other. So basically, Paul said, if eating meat will cause somebody to stumble, then he's not going to eat meat. And that's what he says. That's the context. And so the same thing can be said about alcohol. The same thing can be said about wine. Now, drunkenness, as I said, that's clear cut. Anything leading up to that is a conversation that needs to be had, and I think that is worth having in our culture, because our culture has a lot of alcohol tones and everything built in. Where I grew up in Nigeria, that was not a thing that was common. I didn't have friends who drank. I didn't have any of those, no interaction with alcohol, and so it wasn't very common to see that. When I came to America, though, I noticed there's a different tone, and we can study the sociology of this later, but people were not afraid to talk about any level of drinking, even to excess. And again, this is not a call to condemn. This is a call to encourage and to have us think about what this means in our culture as well. And there's hope for anybody, even one who has struggled with different addictions. They can be set free, essentially. So this is just telling you what I noticed. When I came to America, I noticed that, and that's one of the things that gets into serious debates. I've heard of churches that have split over the topic of alcohol. And so it's very interesting again. Number one, there are some things that are clear-cut, there's no question. Drunkenness and so on and so forth. Number two, what we do, can it lead others to fall? That should then influence our decision. And some of that comes with maturity. And number three, is it profitable at all? Paul said, not everything, some things are permissible, but they're not profitable. And so Jesus turned water into wine. A lot of people take that and it becomes a huge debate. And I just want to encourage us to, number one, focus on the whole Bible and understand what it's calling us to, and to focus on things that help us to grow and to be willing to see how can I grow in any area, and how am I watching out for the weak and the unbeliever that is in my life. So in this part of John, we see that they're at a wedding. Again, it's interesting to see Jesus attending to a matter that seems pretty basic or petty on some level. When the wine finished, they could have just ended the celebration, but Jesus changed the water to wine. So there's another dimension of this conversation we have to turn to. We can't just stop talking about the wine and so on. We have to then look at, Jesus did this. Jesus met a need. And I think of it as, think of a father and a child. And the child has something that they desperately need to be taken care of. And the father makes time and addresses that need. That's pretty profound for the child, where their need is met. And it's interesting that Jesus met a need at that particular time. Now we see Jesus meeting many other needs later on. But it's amazing that Jesus, the King of Kings, the creator of the heavens and the earth, makes time to deal with petty issues. Again, I call it petty because in the grand scheme of things, you might have just said, okay, bye, everybody, just go home. But he met that need. So let's take a few lessons and then we'll get into the discussion. Number one, it's interesting that Jesus had never performed a miracle, as far as we know. But his mother, right, they call it the first miracle that Jesus did. His mother says, hey, they've run out of wine. But he's never done a miracle. So what is the information? Why are you telling him, right? So if Jesus had not performed a miracle so far, why did Mary tell him that they did not have wine? Did she know that he would do a miracle? Did she know that he could do a miracle? And I think at this point, Mary knew that her son was the Son of God. Number two, do you notice how willing the people were to obey Jesus? If somebody told you, hey, go gather some drums, gather some gallons and fill them up, you could have different reactions to that. Some people might think, well, what's he going to do? Let's grab one. Some people might think otherwise. These guys brought everything. Then he said, fill them up. And they filled it up to the brim. It's as if they knew the more we fill this up, the more we get out of this. There was some sort of trust that we're just going to fill this up to the brim and we're going to trust that something's going to happen. Now, rewind back to Elisha and Elijah's days. There was a widow, right? And she was running out of food and this and that. And oil, and Elisha said, I believe it was Elisha, some days I mix up their miracles, but Elisha says basically, bring all your containers or borrow from your neighbors. The same thing. They gathered the containers and they said, basically, they all got filled with oil. They had enough to pay off their people that they owed and so on and so forth. So when we have opportunities to give to the Lord or to give of ourselves, then we need to be willing to go all out rather than, I'm going to give a little bit, right? Because it's interesting. There is a relationship where how willing am I to give of myself, to give of my talents, to give of what God has given me? Because He's the one who knows how best to bless it. And so we need to be willing, like these people at this wedding, right? They were not even disciples of Jesus. They were told to go bring containers. And what did they do? They went all the way. That's a serious call on us. Are we trusting God? Can we trust God for things that we've never even seen Him do before? Just because of faith. And that faith, of course, comes by hearing and of hearing the Word of God. So we can learn lessons about these water pots, these old water pots. That's a whole sermon about filling them up. And then Jesus did something to what they gave, what they filled up. So again, Elisha and Elijah did many things with helping people back in their day. And that was one of the miracles. The more we give, the more we see that God can bless certain situations. Again, this is a very specific passage. I'm not using this out of hand. I'm saying specifically that Jesus did that. But we do see that happening all through our lives too. When we're willing to give, God blesses us for what we give. How are we doing in growing and trusting God to do things we've never seen before? Jesus, again, had never done a miracle, but people were willing to trust Him to do something He had never done before. So part of what I want us to pause and discuss on, or what I want us to dissect or learn from this passage, is that there are times that God will give us faith and the opportunity to trust Him to do something that has never been done before. Remember, He created the heavens and the earth, so He can do anything. And I pray that our faith will grow so that we're willing to follow Him all the way, even when the world thinks that we're crazy, right? Noah is an example. Abraham is an example. Notice a pattern, the heroes of the faith. So part of our extra credit assignment this week is I want to encourage us to read Hebrews 11 so we can highlight these people and see how they trusted God to do things that had never been done before. That's a lot to chew on, but let's go ahead and pause. And I hope that that was encouraging in some of the dissecting of John chapter 2. So let's take a few minutes now and reflect on these passages.